Commissioner Fielder is here.
Very good, Commissioner. Good morning, everybody. This hearing is called to order. For the record, the time is 9 a.m. Today's date is Tuesday, April 19, 2022. This hearing is being held in the Bollinger Room at the offices of the Public Service Commission in Helena, Montana. I am PSC President Jim Brown, and I will be presiding over this matter today. Appearing with me today are Commissioner Jennifer Fielder, Vice President Brad Johnson. I believe Commissioner O'Donnell will be joining us in about an hour, and he'll be appearing virtually. Commission attorneys Amy Hockeluck and Lucas Hamilton will be advising the commission this morning. As noted, this is the scheduled public hearing in docket number 2021.09.112 regarding Northwestern Energy's annual PCAM filing and request for hedging authorization. This hearing is being transcribed by our court reporter. Would you identify yourself? Hi, Lori. Thank you for joining us. I remind each of you that all persons must speak one at a time, identify themselves, and speak clearly into their microphone so that our reporter can capture that. I will now take appearances of counsel. Please introduce yourself and who you'll represent for the applicant.
Ann Hill on behalf of Northwestern Energy, and I have with me Shannon Hine.
Good morning, Mr. President, Commissioners. Please enter the appearance of Jason Brown, Montana Consumer Counsel. And here today with me is Dr. David Dismukes.
Morning. All right, so before we begin the evidentiary portion of this hearing, I will note that recesses will occur at convenient times during the hearing. As provided in the published notice of public hearing, the commission will provide opportunities for public comment at the beginning of the each day of this hearing, which I believe is scheduled for only a one-day hearing. Is there any public comment at this time from the room? Anyone in the room like to make public comment? Seeing nobody, anybody online? Nobody online. All right. Let's move into the evidentiary hearing then. Are there any informal questions before we begin from council? Good. I understand there is one formal pre-hearing matter of which I am currently aware. Northwestern objected to the admission of data request MCC 037, dealing with curtailment due to transmission constraints. Do we want to take that matter up, Mr. Brown?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. It was my intention to move for the admission of all data requests except MCC 37 this morning. And so hopefully that'll resolve that issue.
Council?
Thank you, Mr. President. That's fine. And Northwestern moves for the admission of the data request in our pre-hearing.
Okay, is there any objection to each other's admissions of data requests at this time?
I think we're fine.
And I don't object to the data requests being admitted that Northwestern has identified.
All right, so seeing no objection, those will be admitted into the record, all but MCC 37. Thank you, council, for accommodating us in that regard. Are there any other formal pre-hearing matters? Any accommodation of witnesses?
I did want to request, Mr. Chairman, with the admission of MCC 19, the updated response, which came in on April 8th. Procedurally, it's tempting to take issue with this, but it does appear to be relevant information that was requested much earlier in the proceeding. And so I don't want to object to it or keep it out of the record for the commission, but I would like an opportunity to ask Mr. Dismukes some questions about it, because again, the first time we saw it was about 11 days ago.
Very good, Ms. Hill.
No objection.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
See that being an issue then? Any need to accommodate witnesses today?
Mr. President, I ask that Mr. Andrew Durkin be dismissed after he testifies today.
No objection.
All right. If I forget to do that, just remind me, please. Okay. At this point in time, we'll swear in the witnesses. All witnesses that are in the room, please stand and raise your right hands. Very good. Please, well, do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you. You may be seated. Counsel, I'd note that if any of your witnesses were not in the room this morning or appearing remotely, that they'll need to be sworn in before they testify again. I would ask you to remind me of that if it happens. All right, this would be the point in our hearing for opening statements. So.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Commissioners. Ann Hill on behalf of Northwestern Energy. We have two contested issues to present to you today for decision. The first issue is Northwestern's forecast of demand side management cost. And the second issue is Northwestern's proposal to address the risk of, that's associated with obtaining supply. For the demand side management issue, it's often called DSM, Northwestern wants to continue to use the same method for forecasting costs that has been successful in the past. The MCC proposes a new method. Northwestern is required to purchase DSM resources, and you allow 100% recovery of those. And the MCC is not proposing a disallowance of those costs. The issue today is simply timely recovery of cost through an accurate forecast. Northwestern's witness, Ms. Williams, will explain that her forecasting method includes avoided cost. She will explain that Northwestern evaluates DSM resources and evaluates whether they're cost effective by considering multiple factors, including avoided cost. And she will explain that a forecast that ignores avoided cost will not be accurate and will not allow for Northwestern to timely recover its cost. Second issue we have, the second issue we have for you is Northwestern's proposal to mitigate risk. Northwestern's witness, Mr. Markovich, will explain that a tool to mitigate against risk when acquiring supply is fixed price off-system purchases. In 2016, Northwestern agreed not to use this tool unless it got PSC approval. And that's why we put that request in the application. We're here to get your approval for these transactions. I provided you with a handout of the data request MCC 19 that Mr. Markovich will refer to in explaining today how market risk has changed over the last 6 to 7 years. He will explain the red lines in the graph and show the changes in daily market prices. Northwestern's proposal for off-system purchases is sometimes referred to as a hedging program, but today we'll explain that we're not asking for a formalized hedging program. We're asking for limited approval to enter into short-term, 3 months or less, short-term, fixed price transactions. These transactions are limited to peak demand. And because of those limitations, these transactions will address Northwestern's need for supply. But they address needed supply while considering economic risk. Before I call Mr. Markovich and Ms. Williams, I'd like to first start off with calling Mr. Durkin, who will present our application and his uncontested testimony in this docket. So when you're ready, Mr. President, I'll call Mr. Durkin.
Mr. Brown, I presume you reserve your opening statement to your case in chief.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, you may call your witness.
I call Andrew Durkin. Mr. President, Mr. Durkin was present in the room and previously sworn in. So Mr. Durkin, could you please state your name and business address for the record?
Andrew Durkin, Durkin, 11 East Park Street in Butte,
And who are you employed by?
Northwestern,
And what's your title with Northwestern?
Manager of Regulatory Affairs.
You should have before you two exhibits. Do you have those before you?
I do.
Could you identify those documents?
Exhibit NWE 1 is the request for hedging authorization application, and NWE 2 is my pre-filed direct testimony.
Do you have any corrections to make to your testimony?
No, I don't.
Do you have any changes to make to your testimony?
No, I don't.
Mr. President, I move that NWE 1 be entered into evidence as exhibit. As Northwestern's application be admitted into evidence as exhibit NWE 1.
Mr. Brown, any objection?
No objection.
All right, so ordered, it's entered into record.
And I move that Mr. Durkin's testimony be entered as NWE 2.
Mr. Brown?
No objection.
NWA 2 is entered into the record.
And I tender this witness for cross-examination.
Mr. Brown?
No questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that this witness be permanently excused.
Yeah, I'd like to take the opportunity to allow commissioners to ask questions of this witness. Vice President Johnson?
Nothing from me, Mr. President.
Okay, Commissioner Fielder?
I have no questions, Mr. President.
All right, and I have no questions for this witness either. So seeing that, Mr. Durkin, you are excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I next call Ms. Danny Williams. Good morning, Ms. Williams.
Good morning.
Could you please state your name and business address for the record?
Danny Williams, DANIE, 40 East Park Street, Butte, Montana.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
What's your title with Northwestern?
Manager Energy Efficiency, DSM Services.
And you should have an exhibit before you. Can you identify that exhibit or two?
Yep. Exhibit NWE 3, as well as exhibit NWE 4.
And what is exhibit NWE 3?
My pre-filed direct testimony.
Do you have any corrections to that testimony?
I do not.
Do you have any changes to that testimony?
I do not.
And what is exhibit NWE 4?
It is a pre-filed rebuttal testimony of mine.
Do you have any corrections to that testimony?
I do not.
Do you have any changes?
No.
Mr. President, I move that exhibit NWE 3, Ms. Williams' direct testimony be admitted into.
Mr. Brown?
No objection.
All right, it's so ordered. NW3 is entered into evidence.
Mr. President, I move that exhibit NWE 4, Ms. Williams' rebuttal testimony be moved into.
Mr. Brown?
No objection.
All right, seeing no objection, Northwest Energy number 4 will be moved into evidence.
I tender this witness for cross-examination.
Mr. Brown?
No questions, Mr. President.
Very good. Vice President Johnson?
No questions, Mr. President.
Commissioner Fielder?
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, I also have no questions for you. Ms. Hill?
If there's no questions, then I have no redirect. So I guess I ask this witness be excused.
Okay, and Mr. Brown, any objection to?
No objection.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So for our third and final witness, Mr. President, I call Kevin Markovich.
Mr. Markovich?
Good morning, Mr. Markovich.
Good morning, Ms. Hill.
Could you state your name, spelling your last name?
Kevin Markovich, Markovich.
Could you state your business address for the record?
11 East Park, Butte, Montana.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title with Northwestern?
I am the Director of Energy Supply Market Operations.
You should have two exhibits before you. Could you identify those exhibits?
Yes, they're my pre-filed direct testimony and my pre-filed rebuttal testimony.
So let's take your direct testimony first. Do you have any corrections to that testimony?
I do not.
Do you have any changes to that testimony?
I do not.
And let's look at your rebuttal testimony. Do you have any corrections to that testimony?
I do not.
Do you have any changes to that testimony?
I do not.
Mr. President, I move that the exhibit marked as NWE4, NWE5, that is Mr. Markovich's direct testimony, be moved into evidence.
Mr. Brown?
No objection.
All right, seeing no objection, Northwest Energy number 5 is moved into evidence.
Mr. President, I move that Mr. Markovich's rebuttal testimony marked as NWE6 be moved into evidence.
Mr. Brown?
No objection.
All right, seeing no objection, Northwest Energy number 6 is moved into evidence.
Mr. President, I tender this witness for cross-examination.
All right, very good. Mr. Brown?
Mr. President, no questions. Thank you.
Vice President Johnson?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Markovich, welcome. I haven't seen you for a while. Good to
It's
see
been
you.
a while, yes. I was thinking about that. I think I've been doing this for 15 years and it's been a long time since my last one.
Well, we're glad to have you back.
Thank you.
I have a series of questions for you, and just start down this list, and some of this may be kind of rudimentary, but I think it's important to get some of this in the record, and so we'll just go through all of this. First, when we talk about the transactions that would result as a result of approval of this request, would those be strictly in Mid-C, or would there be other providers that you'd be going to make these purchases?
Right now, based on the stipulation that was signed in 2016, we are prohibited from entering into transactions at Mid-C for the purpose of locking in prices. We can do it in Montana. There was no prohibition on it. But the Montana market is dried up. I mean, Colstrip 1 and 2 is gone. The West Coast utilities are doing other things with their energy. So there's a very, I would call it an illiquid market. So we want to be able to go back out to Mid-C, right at the Mid-Columbia Trading Hub, and perform our fixed price purchases there.
But would there be providers, assuming that request was approved, would there be other providers you would go to for purchases, or it would be strictly through Mid-C?
Well, within the Mid-C Trading Hub, there's probably 50, 75, 100 market participants. So we would have access to each of
But
those.
within the
entities.
Mid-C group?
Within the Mid-C
All
group,
right,
yes.
thank you. Would Northwestern be expected to meet security requirements when these purchases were made? Is there any risk of if there was security required, risk to that security if something went awry?
Absolutely. That's a good question. We have I think, as you know, we have a very robust risk management system and structure in place. And part of that is credit. And before we can enter into a transaction with another entity, we must make sure that they're creditworthy, and the other entity makes sure that we're creditworthy. And what happens in most instances, each entity gives each other a certain amount of open access or free credit, a credit line. And then based on that, it's calculated every day. It's called mark to market. They look at that transaction and say, what would it cost to replace that? And they compare that to what the credit limit is. And if by chance we entered into a transaction that went over the free credit we got, then they would most likely ask us to post some type of collateral, a letter of credit or cash.
Is there a way to quantify what that exposure might be?
It depends on the transaction and it depends on the counterparty with whom we are transacting. But in most instances, based on our proposal, we're looking for short durations, no more than 12 months prior to delivery. So I would think it would take a pretty substantial movement against us in order for us to be required to post some type of collateral.
All of those counterparties would be again under this mid-C umbrella.
Correct.
Is there any kind of advantage or favored status that goes to Northwestern, given the fact that you're a regulated utility in this market?
Absolutely not. No, all the participants are out there and of equal footing, and the fact that we're an IOU really has no bearing on the transaction.
Northwestern has just recently entered the energy imbalance market. How does y'all's entry into that market impact your approach to this request in terms of acquiring hedging as a tool? How do they impact each other?
Well, we entered into the energy imbalance market on June 16th of last year. And it has been a fundamental change to our operations, to our shop. And in the old days, we just did it all alone and we set aside capacity and we watched our area control error to make sure it stayed within the boundaries. And now we're within organized market, and within that, there are certain requirements that prior to each hour, we must pass both capacity and energy tests. And if we cannot pass those with adequate amounts of capacity, then we're locked out of the market for that hour. So consequently, the only really efficient way to provide that capacity is through internal resources. So therefore, if we have to set aside the resources for capacity, that takes away the energy that they can produce. And so therefore, we need to go out and buy more energy. And so this would be part of that program.
The hedging program that you all are proposing takes into account then your involvement in the EIM.
Absolutely.
This whole idea of there being a risk management policy in place for Northwestern is not new. I think you've testified it's 20 years old, give or take. Does that policy, now I realize we took that hedging tool away in 2016, but are there provisions within the risk management policy, even though you can't currently use them, that address the question of hedging?
For sure. And the foundation of our risk management policy is, I would characterize it as being as conservative as any other risk policy in the country. It is based on the premise that there's no speculative trading. And the belief is the customers in Northwestern don't want us out gambling with their electricity bill, what it's going to be, trying to make profit or loss. So therefore, what we try to do is risk mitigation. We try to manage the risk that's out there in an appropriate manner, but in no way are we trying to gamble for the benefit of customers or to their detriment.
No, are those existing hedging parameters, program parameters, currently in the record here?
I'll have to check with Ms. Hill. I don't know if our policy has ever been in the record. It's a 110 or 12-page document, but I just don't know if it's been in a previous document.
Based on a lot of what we do, 110 pages is anything. Other than the change that we mandated in 2016 with regard to hedging, how has the risk management policy evolved over time? What lessons have you learned? And I guess especially, has there been any kind of evolution in that regard since our decision in 2016, which followed, let's face it, not a stellar record on the efforts to hedge leading up to that decision?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It'll give me an opportunity to really kind of give the history of this. As you know, Vice Chairman Johnson, we became the quote default supplier or the supplier of last resort. On July 1st, 2002, I was working the desk at that time. And our portfolio supply was very, very immature. We had 100 megawatts of QF contracts, and we had a buyback contract from PPL, and our customers were exposed in really material manners to the market. And so we limped along and we got going there. And finally, in around 2009, 2010, we just said, hey, the customers have too much risk. We had seen what happened in the California energy crisis where, you know, prices were $300 or $400 for 6 months in a row. So we said we have to guard against increases in market prices over time. So we instituted a hedging program where we'd go out 1, 2, and 3 years advance in it forward. We even did a transaction that was 10 years forward in order to kind of stay ahead of that in the event that the market just over, you know, through inflation, just increased. Well, then we purchased the hydros. And at that point, it was like, now your portfolio isn't so immature. You've got some capacity. We got the Colstrip 4 unit in. So they said, stop doing the hedging. And on the hedging, and one other thing I want to talk about the past program is, I think the record says it was $108 million in hedging losses. That was overall supply during that period was close to $2 billion. So, I mean, yes, $100 million is a lot of money, but the money that was at stake was a lot of money as well. So we weren't that upset about the prohibition on hedging. The market was still kind of normal. But what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years is the thermal generation, the coal plants, the natural gas plants are going away, and they're being replaced with intermittent resources, solar and wind. They're good resources. We support that. But what happens is there's times the volatility has increased because at times the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. All of a sudden the market has to dig deeper into the stack of resources, and it creates this volatile issue. So our new proposal is not protecting against market prices over time. It's short-term spikes in prices. And that's what we're trying to guard against, to ensure against for our customers and ourselves.
Your testimony, Mr. Markovich, outlines parameter sideboards, et cetera, with regard to the program you're now asking us to approve. Does a formal written proposal exist for that is would actually be a policy statement of this is the program, as opposed to kind of the outline that you've offered in your testimony? Is there a formal written policy that we're being asked to approve?
You know, we purposely did not put together a formal hedging program. And if you look at the information in this docket, there seems to be people leaning toward that. We need a mechanical thing that says on Tuesday of the month, you buy this many, and the Wednesday before the end of the month, you buy this many, and make it mechanical. That's not what we're proposing. What only thing we're proposing is give us one more tool in our toolkit, so that as we look and we study each individual month or each individual week, we will have one more ability, one more tool in order to protect against severe catastrophic events. So it's like every day we have pricing meetings, every single day, and there's probably 6 or 7 of us, and we go through the market fundamentals. What are hydro conditions? What's the weather like? What any new loads coming on? And we assess each month going forward to determine what is the risk there. Are these forward prices appropriately priced? And we would continue to do that even with more emphasis now in order to have what we feel is the right amount of information to make an informed decision on whether or not to enter into one of these transactions.
So if approved, your use of the hedging tool wouldn't be automatic. There may be some of those evaluations that say, no, we're not going to go purchase ahead.
Correct. There would have to be, and if you trade electricity, I always say, and I tell our folks, you have to have a position. Someone says, is the market going up or is the market going down? If you're doing your job, you have to say, I believe it's underpriced, or I believe it's overpriced, and this is why I do it. And if all of a sudden you get 5 or 6 people that combined experience is probably over 100 years in the mid-C market, and everybody has their own opinion, you quantify them, you talk about it, eventually you're going to come to some kind of consensus. And that's what we're proposing.
With the implementation of the 90-10 sharing provision in PCAM for y'all, you have suggested in your testimony that 10% stake, if you will, that you have creates some skin in the game and incentive for you to be especially cautious as you enter into to these transactions. And is that a correct assessment of how you've characterized that 90-10?
Absolutely. It's why we are doing this. And it really befuddles me why the MCC is kind of opposing this. We have equal incentives. Our shareholders and our customers are incented in the exact same way. They want to procure the energy supply at the lowest possible means. And so therefore, we think it's appropriate to present this to you. We're in the game together. Let's do it together. If we win, customers win and shareholders win. If we make bad decisions, customers lose and shareholders lose. We think the alignment is perfect there. And let me just put the amount of skin that's in the game. The docket we're talking about right now is 22 million. We incurred supply costs $22 million higher than our base. We ran a calculation for the tracking period we're in today, the one that ends on June 30th. And a year from now,
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object that I don't think this is what was requested in the question, and he's testifying to a question that wasn't asked. With new analysis that has not previously been presented, he's about to present, it appears.
I will sustain that. I believe it's beyond the scope of the direct testimony.
Mr. Markovich, so there's agreement though that 10% represents skin in the game, and so there's that incentive. It's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility going forward that either the legislature or this commission would remove that sharing provision from PCAM. Now, I'm assuming that were that to happen, that Northwestern wouldn't suddenly just become cavalier with its approach to hedging. What incentives in the absence of the cost sharing exist to encourage Northwestern to continue that caution and that vigilance as they're evaluating these potential hedges?
well, first of all, we're all professionals and we come to work and we do our jobs and we do it diligently. When I walk into work in the morning, I don't say I'm going to work really hard for shareholders and I don't care about customers. My job is to provide supply at the least possible cost, given the appropriate amount of risk. And therefore, I feel like if our customers are happy, they're going to be more happy with Northwestern. So we just don't separate. There's this belief that we separate shareholders from customers. We do it for the good of the order. And that sounds kind of cheesy, but it's the truth.
And I appreciate that. So if in fact that provision were removed by the legislature, conceptually, realizing the devil is always in the details, conceptually, would Northwestern think it appropriate for this commission to continue to apply some kind of cost-sharing measure on the hedging program as it went forward?
We would have to see what the changes were. The one thing we would do, and we'd have to assess that, and so we're speculating as to what might happen, is before Northwestern would ever want to agree to something like that, the rules of the game would have to be established. It can't be a heads you win, tails I lose. All the good trades go in the PCAM, the bad ones stay with the company. So if that comes about, we will certainly look at that, but we would have to have an established set of procedures.
Let me rephrase. I don't believe I heard great objection to the existing policy that in fact it created this incentive to be especially cautious. And so I'm asking conceptually, if the commission were to continue to have that incentive in place, would that be acceptable to Northwest?
We don't believe the 90-10 sharing mechanism as it is provides the skin in the game, the incentive that maybe it was intended to do. This is a service that we have, it's a pass-through service, and yet if we don't meet some kind of budget or benchmark, then we have 10% that we have to eat. And so I would say that, let me put it this way, the elimination of the 90-10 sharing mechanism, which I think is the right thing to do, will not cause us to be any less diligent in providing supply service to customers.
Okay, and I think you just clarified for me where you all said that you think the elimination of 90-10 would be the appropriate thing to do. Is that
Correct.
right? Okay, all right, thank you for that. Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the remarketing costs on system, off system. Stated that those costs are substantially higher on system than off system, and just kind of take a few minutes and walk us through, if you would, what the remarketing costs are and why there's that differential between on and off system transactions.
Okay. I'll use the first example is, let's assume that we buy 100 megawatts of on-peak power in Montana. It's delivered to the Northwestern's balancing authority. And there's days, and if it's for a month or a quarter, there's going to be days when we need all that to serve load, and we're going to serve it, and people are going to turn their lights on, and it's going to be fine. But there's going to be other days within that time period where that load just isn't there and it's not needed. So we will have excess energy. In those instances, we have to find a way to remarket it or to sell that excess energy. There's not a good, robust market in Montana. So the first thing we would do, and let's in my example, let's just say we had 40 extra megawatts. We would buy point-to-point transmission from wherever that supply existed to a point, an interconnection point on our transmission system, normally our interconnection with Bonneville. That would cost us $4.62 per megawatt hour times 40, plus 2.8% losses. So we'd have to, have 42 megawatts or some 41. That would get us to Bonneville. And then we would have to take it and buy a transmission on Bonneville. And their transmission rates are a little bit lower than ours. And that would get us to the Mid-Sea Trading Hub. So we have two legs of transmission. Call it $5 on Northwestern, call it $4 on Bonneville, and then we sell it at the market. Okay, so right away you're getting for your sales price X minus $9. If we have a transaction at Mid-Sea and that energy is not needed, we merely sell it back at Mid-Sea at X, but we don't incur the $9 wheeling cost to dispose of it.
And this is in all likelihood, essentially excess power that was acquired through one of these hedges.
It would be, the hedge would protect the actual physical electrons that we bought, that we would buy somewhere else. Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about the analogy, Mr. Markovich, that you used with regard to this hedging program being something comparable to homeowners insurance, right off the bat. I would point out, I certainly know when I go to see my agent at State Farm, I know exactly what that protection is going to cost me going in. So it would seem to me there's a fundamental difference right there. But go ahead and speak to that if you would.
That's a good question. I mean, and what we're talking about, whether we call it hedging or whether we call it insurance, what we're trying to do is avoid catastrophic events. things that would be devastating to customers and the company. The example I've used in prior dockets is in the 2000 California energy crisis, we had a full buyback contract from PP&L at $22.85 for every single megawatt hour we needed to serve customers. That cost $140 million during that California energy crisis. If we had been exposed to the market during that period and had to pay market prices, the cost would have been $1.4 billion. So we paid $140 million to supply customers, and customers paid that. And if we were at the market, it would have been $1.4 billion. If you get a $2,000 a month electric bill, month after month after month, are you going to be able to pay it? Will the company be able to pay its bills? Will they even be able to buy the energy to serve the load? So what we're talking about right now is not to make quote gains and losses, but to protect against catastrophic events. And what I always say is I buy insurance for my car too. At the end of 6 months, if I haven't had an accident and I haven't had a claim, I'm not mad. I'm not mad because I didn't use that money. I'm happy that I was protected in the event that it wasn't. And in this, our proposal right now is so much more limited. It's so much smaller. It'll give us some adequate protection, but we don't not believe it nearly the cost of what the prior hedging program did.
So in terms of the cost, the risk, the exposure, that really is an unknown as you're entering into these transactions. It's a best guess situation based on projections. That's correct?
Correct. So I mean, as we analyze each month forward, and we will do that, we'll stress test the portfolio to see what happens. Okay, how much market exposure do we have? And what if market prices go to $300 for 10 straight days or $300 for the whole month? What would this do to us? And we'll do that type of scenario analysis, and we'll try to figure out what is an appropriate level of quote insurance to avoid that catastrophic event like happened in California.
So that monthly evaluation of the hedges would impact what you do going forward is hopefully a learning tool then? Is that?
For sure. We will use history to help us predict the future, but the information before entering into a transaction, it's the future information that is the most important.
Or is there any way, given the unknowability, the uncertainty of the outcome of these transactions, to predict a worst case scenario? How badly can you miss? What's that exposure going to look like? Is there any way to guesstimate any of that?
Well, within this docket, we have some charts and some in response to some data requests showing what our peak deficiency is by month. And if you look at them, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we're exposed the most in July, August, December, January, and February, the hottest months and the coldest months. And I believe in July, it's over 400 megawatts. Or if we get to a peak condition, we would have to buy 400 megawatts each hour to meet that peak load. And so we think it's substantial.
Going forward, looking, there's no way to guess how badly you might miss that number.
We can run a number of scenarios, but the market is the market. The loads are what they are.
With regard to risk management tools, we're talking about this hedging concept. And I'm not suggesting these be adopted. I'm just curious as to what alternatives exist out there. Are there stop loss insurance policies, any kind of risk limiting programs that would be available for purchase that would have known premiums, fixed prices, et cetera?
The foundation of our risk policy, as I mentioned earlier, is very simplified. Where we do no financial transactions, we do no derivatives. We believe that there are some sophisticated speculators out there that are very good at that. And for us to try to take advantage of that, it's just not what we do. We buy energy to supply customers. We want to very simply procure it at what we think is a fair price that won't provide catastrophic events for either the company or customers.
There's not something out there where you could go to the XYZ insurance company or Lloyd's of London or something and say, all right, we want to cap our maximum losses at X number of dollars. What would the premium be for you to provide that guarantee?
Those products exist, but if you think about it, if you're Lloyd's of London or one of those people, you're going to say, okay, I want to protect against July 22. They're going to price that so that any possible risk they believe is out there is going to be embedded in the price they charge you. And so you could probably get that product, but it would be extremely costly.
Aware of any utilities that have gone that route?
No, I'm not aware of any. I know Portland General Electric had some issues with their purchasing, but I'm not sure exact what transactions they used.
How, and getting right close to the end here, Mr. Markovich, how are you going to analyze your wins and losses in the hedging program as it relates to establishing the PCAM base?
It's fair. First of all, again, the foundation of what we're proposing is to mitigate catastrophic risk. Okay, buy insurance for customers. But as you mentioned early, there's a cost to that. And so within the PCAM, we already have lines within the model that show off-system purchases on off-system sales. We will compare those to what the daily prices were. And we'll be able to calculate and say, okay, we bought that insurance for customers and the company. It costs X. Had we not bought that insurance and bought it at the daily price, that supply would have cost this much. And that's the cost or the value from the hedging transaction.
So from a risk benefit analysis, your analysis can be granular down to the daily numbers that could be provided to us?
Down to hourly.
Hourly. That's pretty granular, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
And well, actually, I guess we've really kind of covered that. One last question, and it's almost kind of philosophical, but it's very important to me, and I just want to give you a chance to take your time and respond to it. I took a commodity marketing class at the University of Illinois from an individual professor that was extremely influential in that discipline at the time. And first day of class, he said to us, he said, fellas, if you don't remember anything else from this class, remember this. He said that a speculator that dies with a positive net worth has died before his time. And he'd be proud to know I did remember that all these years. But I also think he's right. And I guess what I'd like you to leave us with, Mr. Markovich, is your analysis of the difference between hedging and speculating, and then give us the assurance that we want to hear that Northwestern is in fact not going to cross that line into that area of speculation, because we don't want to see you die before your time.
There you go. Thank you. I don't either. Let me put it this way. Doing nothing is doing something. Okay. If you make a decision to do nothing, you're doing something. So if you rule that you don't want us to enter into these transactions, and we have 400 megawatts exposed to the market in July, and the market blows out, then you've made a decision that says, no, you didn't need to buy any insurance. You just let the market go. So that's the decision you made, and that will be part of the PCAM, and that'll be customers and the company will live with that. So that's a decision. We think informed decisions. It's raining down. We're in a foxhole right now and bombs are all over us with these markets and these prices. We think doing something is better than doing nothing. But if you choose not to allow us to do this, then you've said the market is good. And that's as far as the decision whether or not to hedge. As far as your question regarding how can I make sure you're not speculating, within our middle office, a lady named Dawn Patrice is our risk manager. And if we do a transaction within 1 day, she will have a confirmation from a counterparty that will, and she'll match it up against what we say the trade was. She'll apply the metrics to it. And if she believes that this is a speculative transaction, she has the authority to go to the Energy Supply Board and force us to reverse it, and they'll fire me. So I have almost zero risk that we would start speculating on behalf of customers in the company. I just don't. I think our system is too strong.
You thought we were done, and that led to one more, Mr. Markovich, and the metrics that she would apply. Talk to us about those. What do those look like?
Okay, so she has, it's simplified, very simple. It's each hour of each month, she has a load forecast of what we think. And of course, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in July, the loads are going to be much higher than they are at midnight in July. She then overlays all of our resources, what they're expected to produce, which ones are fixed price. So basically, Colstrip is a fixed price asset because it has a fixed price fuel supply. And then she calculates what amount of market risk do we have each hour. And she would then overlay this transaction onto that process. And if all of a sudden we find hours or days when we're way long fixed price power, that would be a speculative transaction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Markovich. Mr. President, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Commissioner Fielder?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple, I think.
Go ahead.
Mr. Markovich, you were talking with Vice President Johnson about the only time that energy is sold, would be sold to Mid-C is when you have excess power. Is that correct?
Well, the transactions at Mid-C, in my example, I said, say we had 100 megawatts of purchases at Mid-C. In all likelihood, we would sell that 100 megawatts out at Mid-C and try to buy it somewhere closer to Montana. So in my example, we would sell the 100 back out and buy whatever we needed, which would be less, could be less or more than the 100.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is that I thought I heard you say that the only time that Northwestern would sell energy there is when Northwestern has excess power to sell.
Yeah, maybe I didn't do a good job of explaining that. In most instances, now there's time, we own some transmission and we could, the energy that we bought at Mid-C, we would have the ability to wheel it back home in order to serve load. And if we couldn't find energy anywhere else, then we would do that. But in most instances, we would just resell the energy at Mid-C and look to procure a lesser amount closer to our system. So the vast majority of our transactions, off-system purchases would be resold at Mid-C.
Okay. Are any commissions paid to your power marketing people in Northwestern?
No.
Okay, thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Fielder. Mr. Markovich, just a couple quick questions, basically following up on the line of questioning that the Vice President did. From what I understand from your testimony is that Northwestern Energy isn't inclined toward a formulaic hedging program, and I realize your testimony sort of alluding to the fact that this isn't a pure hedging program, if you will. But I think it's fair to represent that MCC's primary concern with this proposal is that Northwest Energy's application has not established specific detail regarding the hedging program, and therefore there's a risk, an unknown risk to the ratepayer. I guess the question for the commission is that based on the application, what parameters are there that we can look to that prevents Northwest Energy from exceeding the limitations that you represent in your application? And so, for example, I'll give you an example, is that Northwest Energy has stated that it is not going to engage in transactions longer than the 12-month period. But what do we have as a commission to rely on to ensure that that doesn't happen?
We have our middle office, and I mentioned about Ms. Patrice, and that monitors, and it's an independent body from the people of those of us who transact. And she reports up through the CFO rather than up through the supply portion. So that system is very, there's just so much money at risk. It's very timely. And so she would know within 2 days. I mean, if we did something that was outside of the parameters that we have established in this docket.
And let me ask you about changes that have occurred to Northwest Energy's portfolio since, say, 2016, when the commission placed a limitation on the company's ability to engage in these kind of transactions. MCC has averred, I believe, that about 6% of your wholesale purchases are subject to market price volatility. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with Dr. Dismuke's calculation of it. I think he netted them, and I think they need to be looked separately, gross. Let's look at purchases separately from sales. And if you look at our portfolio, our loads are greatest during on-peak hours. And that's when we have most of our purchases. And our loads are lowest during off-peak hours, and that's when we have most of our sales. So we're buying during the highest times, selling during the lowest times. And I think they need to be separated and not just netted down to the 6%.
So do you know what, forgive me if I use this term, but do you know what the exposure was for Northwest Energy in 2016 or 2012 for going out on the market to purchase? I mean, as the percentage is lowered clearly over time, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so as I understand MCC's position is that this program isn't needed because Northwest Energy has a small percentage of its portfolio that would be subject to market price volatility. It seems to me that mitigates, in turn, the argument can be made that mitigates against the risk of this program, correct? Because such a small portion of your wholesale purchases are subject to market price volatility. How do you respond?
Well, I respond to, I don't think it's just that simple. 12 months out of the year, 7 months, there's risk there, but I mean, it's, those are called shoulder months. They're not that. What we're trying to guard against is the July 100 degrees across the state, December's 30 below across the state, when our loads are highest, and have some way to kind of shave off those peaks, have some way to mitigate the alternative to go out and pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars to meet those loads.
I'm sure that exactly answered my question, but I'll leave it. I just want to understand that, and mainly I'm going to ask this question for public consumption, really, for those that are watching today. So as I understand it, is Northwest Energy's position that if the commission approves this hedging proposal, we're not guaranteeing lower prices for the consumer, correct?
Correct.
The idea of the program is to protect the consumer against volatile price spikes.
Catastrophic events.
But as I understand the mechanics of the program, Northwest Energy, in theory, could be paying a premium to engage in one of these advanced purchases, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Questions about, I'm going to ask you some questions about the mechanics of the program. Get my notes here. So I've read through the application. Some questions though about the mechanics of it. So how does Northwest Energy propose to include, and I'm going to call it hedges, if you will, into the base?
Right now, when we establish the base, it's based on current forward prices, and we will have assumed 0 hedges within that base. We will assume that we're buying everything at the forward prices. The one thing when we establish the base, the first thing we know is it's wrong. I mean, it's at one point in time, you look out 12 months forward, you have a forward price, and that forward curve changes the next day.
So you may have already answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. So how do you project the value then? Is it going to be based on a market value for what you would include?
At the end of the day, when it's all said and done, and we come into this docket like this, and we show what our actual costs were, we will have a calculation and we will have testimony that says, we bought this much insurance and it costs customers and the company this much, and we shouldn't have done that. Or we'll say that insurance saved customers and the company this much in expenses because the market blew out. And that's, I think Commissioner Johnson was talking about, how do you know whether it's a good deal to buy this insurance or the cost of it?
Other further questions from me, Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. President. I think just a couple. On some of the questions that the president just asked, with respect to the 6% figure that Dr. Dismukes calculated, you said that he got that from netting and that it should be gross. Do you recall that?
I do.
So if you were just to agree for the purpose of argument, I understand you're not agreeing, but if you were to take the netting approach, is Dr. Dismukes' math right? And is that calculation correct under that approach?
From a volumetric standpoint, yes, you could defend that 6%. The problem is you buy it high and sell it low.
Okay,
So when
and
you apply dollars to it,
I'm just
doesn't work.
trying to ascertain whether there's any dispute about the 6% figure in and of itself or what it purports to be. It sounds like there isn't. And with respect to the gross numbers that you say should be looked at, are those in the record?
They're easily determined through looking at exhibit KJM1 and KJM2. You can get to those volumes. I believe that's how Dr. Dismukes performed his calculation.
And the President Brown asked you, I think, how, if this hedging is allowed to resume and start up again, how the hedges will be reflected in future PCAM base. And I'm not sure that you answered that. So I guess I just want to ask, in like the upcoming rate case, assuming this is approved, the request in this case, would the PCAM base include any hedging costs?
No.
Okay. So the entire difference between, okay, I think that's clear enough. You're proposing to subject all of the hedging gains or losses to 90-10 sharing?
Correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. So,
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Markovich, can the commission issue an order that limits the transactions to what you've proposed in this application?
I believe so. I'm not an authority on the regulations. Ms. Heim might know better than me, but
So, I mean, if the commission issues an order limiting the types of transactions you can enter into, you would follow that order.
oh, absolutely.
Will the commission get to review the prudency of the transactions?
Every single year.
And what happens if the commission does not approve Northwestern's proposal for off-system transactions?
As I mentioned, doing nothing is a decision to do nothing. It's doing something. And we will continue to go about our business the way we have. Now, I'm sure internally, our company will look at it and say, do we want to do this on behalf of shareholders and cut customers out and not have them part of this program that we think is right? But that would be an iterative process within our internal company.
I have no further questions.
Commissioner O'Donnell, did you join us?
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you had a safe trip back from Sydney. I think
you.
we had just concluded with your testimony. I will excuse you at this time.
Thank you.
So,
May we take a short break before the next witness?
absolutely, we're running ahead of schedule, I would say, at this point in time. So, actually, we're running behind. Why don't we take 15 minutes? We'll come back at 10:20, and we'll go off the record at this point in time. All right, Commissioner Field, are you still on?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell on. Commissioner Field, are you on? Yeah, she's muted. Hi, Commissioner Fielder, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, very
At
good.
least one more.
Watched clock.
All right, the time is now 10:20 a.m. We'll go back on the record. I think, Ms. Hill, that you concluded your case in chief at this point in time?
That's correct, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Brown, you may now proceed with your case in chief. You reserved the ability to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioners, and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think this case is really pretty straightforward. I'd like to believe our DSM issue could have been resolved without a hearing. I will let the testimony speak for itself on that issue. And I would say I don't think we'd probably be here today if Northwestern wasn't asking for authorization to do hedging again. This probably could have been a routine uncontested PCAM, but for this unusual forward-looking request that they've included in this filing. And I would direct you to Exhibit DED1 for a little bit of context and history on how the PCAM has operated since it began. That exhibit shows the over-under collections each year and the ratepayer share and the company share. So hedging is the reason I think we're here today primarily, and it's been characterized as a tool to mitigate risk. Well, I would ask you to consider for whom is it mitigating risk? And it's also been characterized as limited to peak demand, but I would submit that it's a pretty blunt tool for that. If the goal is to really deal with short-term price spikes, it seems strange or to shave off those peaks, as was said this morning. It seems like a blunt tool to only be able to do that on a monthly or quarterly basis. So let me explain why MCC opposes hedging electric supply. I think there's four main reasons. The first is what a poor track record this particular utility has, both costing ratepayers more money as a direct result of hedging and not having the parameters or protocols in place to really even assess how they're doing. Past losses have been staggering just on the electric side. Ratepayers have paid over $108 million for electric hedging losses from 2011 through 2016. And I would direct your attention to Exhibit DED3, which, or excuse me, DED. Excuse me, DED2, which shows each tracker year from 2011 through 2016. For that first 2011 to 12, the amount is 16.8 million. 12 to 13 tracker was 19.8 million. The 13 to 14 tracker was 16.6 million. The 14-15 tracker was 27.1 million, and the 15-16 tracker was 27.7 million. That's where the 108 million comes from. The second reason is that Northwestern has not shown a need for hedging. I would submit that everything in the portfolio except hourly spot market purchases is a type of hedge. Ratepayers are already locked into paying fixed rates for the majority of resources. You heard this morning that CU4, for example, is a fixed priced asset. So the market exposure is relatively small today compared to the past and even compared to other utilities. 94% of energy requirements are currently met with either owned or QF power. And once the Laurel gas station is operational, assuming that project is built, the exposure will be even less. The company appears to believe that there should be no market exposure whatsoever. But I don't think the commission needs to agree with that logic, which I don't think has been adequately supported in this case. The third reason that MCC opposes hedging here is that the parameters are once again poorly defined. Although the amount of portfolio exposed to the market may be smaller than it used to be, one can still lose a lot of money over the course of a month. The amount of portfolio exposed is only one of the variables that will determine the gains or losses here. If Northwestern's crystal ball, for example, forecasts a big winter storm in February that never materializes, that will result in ratepayers paying more for energy in every hour of that month than they would have had there not been a hedge. So the amount of losses could still be large, even though the market exposure is smaller than it used to be. And these parameters or protocols should be more than just a time period. For example, price triggers, the percentage of the portfolio that's already hedged, the liquidity of the market. I don't think these are rigid or formulaic criteria that could be written out and provided to this commission. And I would submit to you that this would be speculative. Perhaps there's some term of art that is not defined in this case, but the common meaning of speculation is guessing or estimating or forecasting. And you heard this morning, Mr. Markovich agree with Commissioner Johnson that this would require them to make their best guess about a number of things, and that it's the future information that's most important here in making these decisions. So they would be speculating at least once a month about the weather for that entire month, about what loads will be for that month, and about what market prices will be for that month. So I think we have a fundamental disagreement about whether this proposal would involve speculation on the part of Northwestern. The fourth reason is that the incentives are just not there. And that's because ratepayers are backing up these bets. The counterparties, as you heard this morning, are sophisticated speculators. You heard Mr. Markovich say there are sophisticated speculators out there. Well, those folks are going to be speculating on these hedges that we're talking about today. And those counterparties have a very strong incentive to win their bets. There's nobody backing up their bets, or 90% of their bet. And Northwestern says, once again, that they're not even trying to win these bets or even break even. They're thinking of this as an insurance policy whose cost is unknown on the front end, and that this is going to cost more money. That's the expectation you've heard today. I would submit, and I suppose perhaps this is a difference of opinion, but I think being regulated does confer a special status. If you know that 90% of your costs are going to be passed on to your captive ratepayers, I think that gives you a special status compared to a market actor who can't do that, who can't just pass on hedging losses or 90% of hedging losses. I mean, how hard would you try to win if someone else was putting up 90% of your money? And how hard would you try to win if 100% of the money you were gambling was your own? This filing is really no different than what we've seen in the past and with respect to these four concerns that I just went through. Even though storms and pricing events occur over the course of a few days or even hours, the most precise or surgical this hedging proposal could be would be monthly or quarterly. There's no requirement to preserve some market exposure. There hasn't been much discussion of that in this record, the merits of that. So this would allow them to hedge down to 0% exposure. The only real difference from before is this 10% sharing we now have under the PCAM. And I would just note that MCC wanted 100% sharing, i.e. no tracker. Or in the alternative, we had proposed 50-50 sharing. So 10% does not seem like a lot of incentive to us, or equal, as you heard this morning. But Northwestern has stated an intention here today to revisit the mechanics of the PCAM and specifically end the 90-10 sharing. And in response to Commissioner Johnson's questions this morning, you heard the 90-10 sharing is the only real incentive here. Forgive me for discounting the professionalism incentive based on the experience of the past. Without the 90-10 sharing, there really is no incentive to win these bets. So I think that could turn out to be a pretty flimsy basis for allowing the hedging, even if it remains in place, but certainly if it goes away. You know, if Northwestern was proposing to keep winnings and losings from hedging, this would be a whole different story. That would simulate the free market incentives that are in place for their counterparties. Or even if they were proposing to split the winnings and losings 50-50, I think this would be a different story. That might protect ratepayers from going through another expensive hedging debacle. But Mr. Markovich stated he wants ratepayers to underwrite 90% of his hedging activities for now, and starting shortly 100% of those activities. And it's not really clear to me why the company wants this so much, because no peak energy costs have ever been challenged to my knowledge. You've not seen any examples of that presented to you here. And we looked closely last year at the peak gas prices that were experienced. We went through 3 rounds of discovery because the company still has to act prudently. Even if there's market exposure, when there's an event, this commission still looks once a year at what they do in response to that event, how they manage that event. And there's a prudence review of that. So just because you are accepting today that there's a relatively small percentage of the portfolio that's exposed to the market, it doesn't mean that you don't get to look at what's actually transpired down the road and make sure that they're doing their job prudently. But we had 3 rounds of discovery on the gas prices last year for that reason. And that tracker was ultimately not contested, even though the prices were very high. It was a significant spike. So it doesn't seem like they face much risk, but what risk there is, this is an effort to put that on ratepayers. Another difference today is that ratepayers used to face monthly tracker adjustments. And today the adjustments are annual. They only happen once a year. And that insulates ratepayers from these price spikes that we're talking about. So again, it's the company that wants this, and they really haven't explained why they need it. But more importantly, they've not shown that this proposal is in the public interest. And I think the testimony of David Dismukes demonstrates that it is not. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would call David Dismukes.
All right, Mr. Dismukes, I recall that you were sworn in this morning, correct? All right. Mr. Brown, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Dismukes, could you please state your name for the record?
David E. Dismukes.
And what is your job title?
I'm a consulting economist with the Acadian Consulting Group.
And did you submit pre-filed testimony in this case?
Yes, sir, I did.
So before you use exhibit marked as MCC1, is that a copy of your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, sir.
And would you have any changes or corrections to make to your testimony today?
No, sir, I do not.
So if I were to ask you the same questions today under oath, your answers would be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move for the admission of MCC1.
So,
No objection.
all right, MCC1 is entered into the record.
And then Dr. Dismukes, I had I'd like to ask you a few questions about Northwestern's updated response to MCC 19. Do you have a copy of that in front of you?
Yes. Actually. Got it. Yeah, thank you. Got it.
Do you recall when this updated response was filed?
This month, I've forgotten the specific date. I want to say, was it April the 4th? Subject to check?
Okay, that's all right. We can, it's the record. And MCC 19, do you have a copy of that in front of you?
I do not have the specific request. I do remember it, though.
Yeah, did that ask Northwestern to identify the time periods used by the company to conclude that the mid-sea market is currently more volatile than it was in previous periods?
Correct, it did.
And their initial response was 2019 to 2021. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then in the updated response, which I'll represent to you, was updated on April 8th, 2022. The response was 2015 through 2021. Is that how you recall?
Yes, sir.
And then subpart E of that data request had asked Northwestern to provide the requested documents in electronic form. And the initial response said no response needed. But did Northwestern provide documents in electronic form with the updated response?
Yes, sir.
And did that include graphs of the mid-sea daily market prices from 2015 through 2021?
Yes, sir, it did.
And so have you reviewed the updates Northwestern has made to its discovery responses in preparation for today's hearing?
I have.
And what did you do to review those?
Well, I compared the response to the original response that was provided. I think we asked that question early in December in this process, after the PCAM had been filed and the proposal had been included in that filing. It was included in a set of discovery, our first set of discovery, asking about the backing for the proposal itself. So I looked at it relative to the context of the request, as well as empirically from the numbers and the trends that were in the spreadsheet itself, and particularly relative to some of the charts and exhibits that I had in my direct testimony.
Okay. And I'll ask you to slow down a little for the court reporter. Has the company's updated responses to MCC 19 resulted in material changes?
I believe so, yeah. If you look at the original request, it was for an express period of time from 2019 to 2021. Now the update has extended that by several years. And I think more importantly is subpart C, where we ask the company explicitly in looking at this request, and I think it's comparable to some of the questions that the president had earlier to Mr. Markovitz. What's the data that you've looked at? What price volatility have you examined with regards to this proposal? And they said nothing has been done. And yet here we are in April on the 4th, and we have a volatility analysis that's been provided. And I think this, in a nutshell, really underscores my problem with this particular program, as well as, I would say, a long experience in reviewing fuel adjustment clauses and purchase gas clauses and in reviewing hedging programs for utilities. And why I think it is very important that these things be documented and that there be protocols in place for hedging programs, because there are always after the fact misunderstandings when it comes to evaluate these programs when they cost ultimately get passed through in a PGA or a fuel adjustment clause or something like the PCAM in a tracker like this. And the fact that now we have a differing set of information, I think underscores that problem. And it's one of the things that I would argue is a very big shortcoming associated with the company's proposal, regardless of what the numbers say or don't say, or the time period examined. And I think that's why it's incumbent. I think Mr. Markovitz earlier had said something to the effect that they want another tool to have in their toolbox to use for their procurement purposes, and that's fine. But if you use a tool without looking at the instructions or the instruction manual or having an instruction manual, you wind up having a problem in how you use that tool. And in some instances, you could wind up, having some kind of negative event arise from that. And I think that's true here with the company's hedging proposal. It needs to have meat on the bones that's defined. Now, I'm not asking and not requesting, and nor is that my opinion, that this be some long novella of protocols and requirements, but going in and documenting what the fundamental outlook is. For instance, that Mr. Markovich talked about, when you're going to formulate that fundamental outlook, when's the deadline for that? How am I going to, who is going to document and sign off on that? How are we going to trade around that fundamental guidance that we're going to be providing throughout the year? Those are all important things. And you know why it's important? Because it's important for a proceeding like this, because later when MCC and other parties and staff and the commission want to go back and look at these hedges and look at what the current thinking was at the time, because nobody expects the company to be perfect. We all know that in forecasting, you're going to be wrong, right? If you want to know and document what that fundamental outlook was, you need to have documentation on that. Now, granted, the commission can go in and require this in its order and put limits on how much is traded, require certain things be done, et cetera. But whose hedging program does it become at that point? Is it the company's proposal or is it the commission's proposal? And I would argue that the burden of proof of that is on the company, not the commission, to go in and have to backtrack and to put all that meat on those bones for that particular program. And this response, to me, really does kind of drive home the problem with all of this.
Thank you. How would you characterize the last 3 years of market price volatility compared to historical patterns?
You know, if you look at the empirical information on this that was provided, I think it in many ways corroborates some of the information that I included in my direct testimony and the exhibits and schedules. By and large, you go back to 2015 and you look through to 2021, you've had periods of relatively uniform or somewhat consistent price volatility as is commonly measured. So if you look at a coefficient of variation, which is essentially the standard deviation divided by the average, it's a standardized measure of volatility, right? You're dividing the mean. So if it's 1 or greater, that volatility is greater than the average in the market, right? If it's less than 1, it's going to be less volatile. That movement is going to be less than the average that you see in the market. You go back and look historically, you're looking at between 0.4 and 0.6 as that coefficient during that time period. And as I noted in my direct testimony, you look at 18, 19, and 21, due to some extreme weather events that occurred during that time period, that volatility picked up to close to 1 or over 1. And in 2019, it was pretty well over 1.
So you've prepared a calculation of the coefficient of variation of the information provided in the updated response to MCC 19?
Yes,
And do you have a copy of that in front of you?
I do.
And is that a true and correct copy of your calculation of the coefficient of variation?
Yes, sir, it is.
Can you, Mr. Brown, can you tell us what he's looking at?
It's the
Mr. President, I believe we
It's the handout here.
hand out. Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
And I will go ahead and move for the admission of this as exhibit MCC 2.
So,
No objection.
right, seeing no objection, MCC 2 is entered into the record.
Dr. Dismukes, was there anything else you wanted to observe about the update to MCC 19 or the volatility issue therein?
No, I think that's it. The calculation is relatively straightforward. That coefficient is just essentially the first row divided by the second row. And you can see in these instances, for instance, in 2018, 2019, and 2021, where that volatility, that standard deviation is moving and spans a dollar amount that's higher than the average during that same year.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dismukes. Mr. President, the witness is available for cross-examination.
Ms. Hill?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Dismukes.
Good morning.
Isn't it common knowledge that prices for market purchases tend to be higher in the summer than during other times of the year?
Yes,
Didn't you testify in a PCAM docket a couple of years ago?
I did.
I have that testimony, Mr. President. May I approach the witness?
You may approach. Can you identify what you've handed the witness?
1 second, because it's not going to be entered into evidence. I'm just refreshing his memory. So, did you testify in April of 2020 in docket 2019-09-058?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And didn't you recommend an almost $7 million disallowance for market purchases that were made in the month of June?
I did.
Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw.
Yes, I did.
And I have your live testimony. May I approach again?
So can you identify what for the record, what you just handed the witness, what he was looking at?
He just looked at his pre-filed testimony in docket 2019-09-058. I was just establishing for the record that he did in fact testify in that docket.
Okay. And you are not moving for the admission of this, correct?
I am not.
All right. You may approach.
In that docket, when you recommended a disallowance, do you recall that disallowance being about market purchases for replacement power costs for Colstrip?
I do. Yes.
And I've placed the document before you. Can you identify what that binder is? I believe on the front page, it'll help.
Yeah, this is the transcripts for the proceedings of that docket.
And can you recall what the basis of your recommendation was for disallowing those costs?
In a nutshell, there was a known problem associated with the CU4 unit. There were questions about its availability for the summer months, and the company did not take appropriate actions to address that availability issue during that time period.
And can you turn to page 357 of the transcript in front of you?
I have that.
And do you agree that that transcript reflects a question and answer between you and Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yes.
And could you turn to page 358 of that transcript?
Yes.
And starting on line 14, it says, and if you have a possibility, could you read that paragraph?
Mr. President, I'd like to see what the witness has before he responds to this.
Ms. Hall, I'm a little bit perplexed as where we're going with this, because are you moving for admission of this?
All I
document?
would like him to do is read that one paragraph from the transcript, and then I'll stop.
And I'd just like to see it first, Mr. Chairman, to know if I have a relevance objection.
I agree with Mr. Brown. He's entitled to see.
I believe that I've laid a foundation to relevance that Mr. Dismukes admitted that he.
Ms. Hill, Mr. Brown's objection is not on relevance at this point. I think co-counsel is entitled to see what is being presented to his witness.
Okay, how do you want to do that?
Mr. Brown can either approach or why don't we go off the record at this point? The time is 10:46 and off the record.
The transfer. 359. Yes, thank you.
All right, the time is now 10:51. We will go back on the record. So I think you were.
Dr. Dismukes, you have testimony from the transcript in the hearing docket 2019-09-058, correct?
Yes.
Could you read on page 358, the paragraph starting on line 14 that ends on the top of page 359? For the record, please.
Sure. Where did you want me to start?
starts-
And if you have a possibility?
Yeah.
Thank you. And if you have a possibility of a unit being down, you could have taken actions to go in and make a seasonal purchase or to hedge, could have done something to get out ahead of this problem, which in this instance was a CU4 outage, in case it happens from an economic perspective. And then when the company had to come in for the PCAM filing, they would have been able to say, well, look, we tried to mitigate against the economic cost of this. We knew it was a touchy issue. What was riding on this, we knew that there was a possibility. So we went in and secured a contract to make sure in the off-peak months to assure that something like this wouldn't happen for us in the summer against that. And that's why we have a cost associated with that additional seasonal purchase for this amount.
And isn't it true that Northwestern has limited its proposal to a monthly peak load?
I believe that is my understanding, yes.
And isn't it true that you have not analyzed the timing of Northwestern's market transactions as it relates to intraday variations?
I have not, and it's not my position to do that. That's something that the company should have done and included in its analysis and didn't. And the only empirical information that I've seen in the record to date is this late filed data request that came in April.
And isn't it true that off-system transactions are no riskier than on-system transactions?
I can't say I haven't looked
Could I get data request number NWE 05 in front of the witness?
Did you hear that last response? It was kind of muted. Mr. Dismukes, make sure you speak directly into the microphone, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. So, Dr. Dismukes, didn't you respond in response to Northwestern data request Northwestern 5 that off-system transactions are no riskier than on-system transactions?
Correct.
And doesn't Northwestern already engage in on-system transactions?
Yes, it does.
I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple of very brief questions. Dr. Dismukes, welcome. Good to see you again. It has
Yes,
been a while.
It has been. Good to be back.
Don't stay away so long. I just don't understand. Dr. Dismukes, would it be fair to characterize you as an expert witness with regard to utility hedging programs?
Yes, I have looked at risk mitigation programs that utilities have used for both purchase power and natural gas and other fuel purchases.
In your experience then in that regard, can you identify or are you aware of utility hedging programs that in fact have been effective and accomplished their goal in terms of mitigating risk?
That's a tough question. For a time period when prices were not super volatile, most utilities were, I guess, relatively successful at doing that. At least they didn't draw regulatory attention. It wasn't until I think some of these positions started to go in differing directions about the same time, coincidentally, that Northwestern had its problems when the market started turning. And a lot of utilities, as I noted before, failed to do a really good job at documenting what their fundamental guidance was going to be for what their hedging program was going to do. And so as a consequence of that, you saw lots of commissions suspend and get rid of hedging programs throughout the United States. I think one of the larger and the more infamous ones for some of the largest electric utilities in the country were in Florida, where it got rid of all its hedging programs for Florida Power and Light, Duke Progress Energy in Florida, TECO, as well as Gulf Power. I know both utilities, IOUs in Wisconsin, theirs were eliminated. A number of natural gas, Cascade, Northwestern eliminated their hedging programs during this time period. And there have been many utilities that I don't know that you can't document through commission orders. They have likely ramped down their positions and are doing less hedging today than they have in the past.
Is there, at least generally speaking, a correlation between risk and the period of time looking forward that the hedge is executed? In other words, is there more risk with a hedge that's going 10 years out versus one that's going 90 days out?
Sure, that's usually the case. That things that are more out in the future are going to be more risky.
And just one more, Mr. President, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said that we're the commission to put parameters on the kind of general proposal that has been brought to us by Northwestern, that it would somehow become the commission's hedging program. And were you suggesting that that's inappropriate? We routinely, as a commission, modify proposals that are brought to us in order to make them what we deem to be more appropriate. So at what point, Dr. Dismuke, can this commission modify a proposal that's brought to us? Where is it appropriate and where is it not appropriate?
Good question. Good question. My point in that is that, by telling the commission, by telling the company what to do, I think you're assuming a degree of responsibilities that really belongs with the company more so than with the commission. And I would have a concern if I were working for the staff, and I have worked as a staff economist before, of putting my commissioners in a position where if you omit something by accident or you haven't gone through this, that you ultimately will be held for that, responsible for that later, because the utility can come back and say, well, look, it wasn't clearly articulated in the order. You didn't tell us to do that. And I think that's where you run into those kinds of problems.
Are there not widely accepted standards and protocols? I thought you even referred to protocols for these kinds of programs.
There are, and I mentioned some in my testimony. And again, if it's the commission's will to go in and do this and adopt the program, I hope they will put those kinds of parameters on there. I'm not saying that you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. And if you are inclined to approve it, I would very strongly request that you do that. But my recommendation in the primary sense would be to not be put in that position. And if you're interested, have the company refile something that meets the parameters that you're interested in having in a hedging program.
Thank you, Dr. Dismuke, and Mr. Chairman. That's all.
Thank you, Vice President Johnson. Commissioner O'Donnell.
No questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. No questions.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Fielder. Well, I would say the Vice President took some of my thunder.
Sorry.
I do want to drill down on what the Vice President was asking you about the parameters and what we may be looking at or not looking at. Did you read Mr. Markovich's rebuttal?
Yes.
Testimony. Do you have that rebuttal testimony in front of you?
Actually, I think I do have. Well, let me see. I think I do have it.
Mr. President, it's with the court reporter, if that's helpful for us to get it back.
I have 2 copies. Yes, sir, I have it.
Right, so you have Mr. Markovich's rebuttal testimony in front of you.
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. Can I direct you to pages 10 and 11 of that testimony?
Okay.
Are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You would agree with me that on those pages, essentially, Mr. Markovich walks through each of the guidelines that I believe you identified as being important considerations for the commission to consider before approving a hedging program, correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
Okay, so let me ask you about those considerations. I'll just flat out ask you, do you agree that the current gap between the PCAM base and the actual supply costs establishes a need for a hedging program in this case?
No, I do
Okay,
not.
tell me why.
Those are just, outcomes that arose from market conditions. I don't know, what you would hedge, what's not known about this hedging program. And the need is, in order to establish a need for a program, you need to know what insurance I'm buying and what position I'm defending. This is just an absolute number that doesn't tell me about my need in terms of proportionality, consistency over time, anticipated consistency, those sorts of things.
Do you agree that the limits established by Northwestern's proposal show that the program is what is as simple as possible?
It's pretty simple. Yeah, I would agree, but I think it's a little too simple and it probably needs a lot more documentation associated with it. I'm not opposed to a relatively straightforward hedging program that kind of gets to the point, but there's not a lot of detail on this. It's not codified anywhere. And I think the frustrating thing is the company hasn't been willing to want to put that in place and to do that. It seems like a pretty straightforward and simple request to do. And yet they have an aversion to that, almost an explicit aversion to doing that. I think that again is a fundamental shortcoming in the proposal.
So what, can you be more specific in what simplifications you would like to see?
Well, I think one is what's going to be the fundamental guidance for the program and how that's going to be established in any given year, what instruments are going to be used, what caps are going to be placed on the program from volumes, as well as a dollar amount. To some of the questions that the vice president had earlier, what are going to be the tools that you'll use for ex post evaluation on whether you did things well, what did you learn, the lessons learned, and what's the feedback loop, so to speak, in going back and including that in the next year's hedging document.
Okay. Would you agree that reducing short-term market risk is a sufficiently specific objective for the proposed hedging program as proposed by Northwest Energy?
It should be, but at what percent? I mean, insurance will have a cost, as Mr. Markovich noted earlier. I don't disagree with that. What costs am I going to be paying for that insurance? That's what I don't know in this. And in order to know that, I need to know what your fundamental outlook is going to be in terms of what you're going to be doing on a forward-going basis. Where do you see the market and what are you hedging against? As I noted in my testimony and some of the data that I've looked at, and maybe Mr. Markovich has a different opinion, and I'm sure he does, but you look at some of these volatile events that I showed on that table earlier and in my direct testimony, a lot of those have been driven by weather-related events, the wildfires that we've had out west. Mr. Markovich's examples were examples from the California energy crisis. Well, that occurred in 1999, and markets are entirely different today and continue to modify and change in ways that I hope, and at least to date, have mitigated some of the problems that were associated with those markets. But if you're trying to go in and mitigate the kind of pricing risk we've seen over the last couple of years that has been really highly weather dependent, I don't know quite how you wind up doing that.
So, as I recall, Mr. Markovich's testimony was that he said, maybe characterizing his testimony, but essentially his assertion was that, Northwest Energy is making a proposal that is not programmatic in nature or formulaic in nature because Northwest Energy needs the flexibility to respond by minute or by hour, correct? So I'm struggling a little bit with determining how much specificity is needed
So that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about it during the discussion. The hedging program wouldn't go in and have that kind of specificity, which is essentially outline the positions that the company expects to be moving in and what it's defending against. There would not be specific targets or wouldn't be percent allocations across different types of purchases of varying different terms. It would be looking at what that exposure is in June, July, and August, where we see that, where we're getting that information, what we're going to do to trade against those, what we're anticipating with our unit availability, other things that go into that, and how we're going to react to it generally, not a specific, let me chart it out, put it in a pie and do that. That would be very difficult and probably counterproductive to do.
Let's talk about budgeting for the hedging proposal. Again, I think the testimony was established earlier that potential costs of a hedging program are generally unknowable at this point in time. How do you agree with that statement?
I do, because I don't know what the company's going to do. So, yeah.
Okay. So how would you propose, or how do you expect the Northwestern Energy would budget for this proposal?
I don't know that there would be a budget per se for the hedging program itself as much as it would be to essentially reduce a certain degree of volatility in percentage terms on either power purchases or on these power purchases. And the outcome would come from after that. I don't know what, because this wouldn't be in the base PCAM, so I don't understand why there would be a need for a budget for this. It just would flow out in the reconciliation.
So final question. It generally relates to the policy, I suppose, behind this type of program. Do you agree that the purpose of a hedging program is to mitigate risks associated with volatility?
Yes.
And I think you testified to this earlier, but I'll just ask it again. Can hedging be a reasonable tool to mitigate risk with?
Absolutely. It's like I tell my students in my class when we talk about energy commodity trading, hedging, speculating, arbitrage, those aren't inherently bad. It's kind of the actions that people take in executing those that can be bad and the implications that they may have for individuals. But they're all very important facets of competitive commodity markets, not just in energy, but in financial ones and other commodity, ag commodities, you name it, financial, foreign exchange, you name it, metals.
Right. And just a comment, your pre-filed testimony was very well done. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
It was very readable and digestible. So thank you. Ms. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Dismukes, do you recall when Vice President Chairman, when Vice President Johnson was asking you, you said it was very difficult to identify a successful hedging program.
Correct.
So it's fair to say that you put a very high standard on any hedging program.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
I guess just to follow up on that last one, is that higher standard you put on hedging programs informed by past experiences and losses specifically with
Yeah,
hedging?
absolutely. And not just in Montana, but in a lot of other states.
I just want to follow up on this transcript handout. Take a little bit deeper dive into that. You were testifying in response to a unit being down, specifically CU4, is that right?
That's correct.
And would the hedging proposal in this case require a unit to be down in order to activate it?
No. I think it's a little different too, in the sense that this was a known, and this was a potentially a strong potential outage that was known of at that time for a fixed amount of capacity that was going to be unavailable. That should have been as much quantity hedged as it was price hedged, right? Because the quantity and the output of the facility wasn't there either.
And do you recall when you discussed or mentioned making a seasonal purchase or hedging here, were off-system mid-sea transactions the only type of hedges you had in mind? Or would there be other ways to have hedged or addressed the CU4 unit being down?
I think at the time I was thinking about more fixed price purchases on a bilateral transaction that the company could have been. A fixed price contract on a bilateral transaction that the company could have entered into.
And then could you turn to page 359 of the transcript?
Don't have it. Here. This is much easier. You said 359?
Yes.
Got it.
I guess I don't recall where you stopped reading, but could you read from lines 3 to 7?
Yeah. So that discussion we were talking before was about the possibility that the company could have gone back in and made that bilateral transaction that you asked me about. And I also went on to explain, and the transcript goes on, I think this goes beyond dash, there's no protocols that the company can point to or identify to, or communications back and forth between this operations group and the market group to take advantage of those kinds of things either. So there are the things that are, I think, is equally bothersome and equally unprepared for, and there is no evidence for in this case that underscores this prudence issue. And I think, well, let me finish that, this prudence issue. It's more important than just the operational issue. I know that's very important to y'all. It's always bad when you read that in a transcript. I really can't talk a lot about the issues between Talon and the company and this contractual relationship and who they can point their fingers to. But anyways, getting back to the crux of this discussion, which I think is consistent with what I've said today, is having this documentation and having it in place that you can reference to it later in the prudence review is very, very important. And it's good for all parties involved. And I think that's true with the hedging program as well, as much like it was with this CU4 issue.
So just to be entirely clear, the problem that you were addressing in that case was different than the alleged problem that's been raised in this case?
Objection
Okay.
leading.
I'll withdraw the question, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have. Thank you.
Very good. Is this witness excused?
Yes, Mr. President, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr.
Appreciate
Smeets.
it. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Mr. Brown, do you have any additional witnesses?
I do not.
Okay, is that the close of your case in chief?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, I will allow 2 minutes for a closing statement if the parties would like to take one.
Will decline.
Very good.
We'll waive.
Okay. All right, so the time is now 11:13 a.m. The evidentiary portion of this hearing is now closed. We will go off the record for a brief scheduling conference. And once at the conclusion of that, we will come back on the record to read the results of the conferral. Read those into the record. So we will go. Hearing is closed. We'll go off the record. Time is now 11:13 a.m.
There are at least 2 of us in this room that believe y'all is a totally acceptable.
It's gender neutral.
But you still can get to that conclusion. It just Having in a courtroom. They'll decide the schedule. So right now, they decide the schedule. Those weird stuff. Done with this part of this thing for today. Got another subject. we have to do.
All right, the time is now 11:23 a.m. and we are back on the record. The results of the scheduling conference will now be read into the record by Staff Attorney Mr. Hamilton. And following that, in order, the PSC.
Thank you, Mr. President. The parties have agreed that Northwestern Energy will file its opening brief and a proposed order within 20 days from the receipt of the transcript. MCC will then have 20 days from service of the response brief to file its, 20 days from service of Northwestern's opening brief to file its response brief and a proposed order. And further, Northwestern Energy has waived the reply.
I'll just clarify that that was the order of the PSC, that no separate order will be issued. I apologize for that. All right, for the record, the time is now 11:24 a.m. Today's date is April 19, 2022, and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.